10 months ago, this was how the world saw the Fourth Arab-Israeli War begin. When Egyptian armor crossed the Suez Canal and struck into Israeli-occupied Sinai, these were the pictures which were relayed by satellite to TV stations around the globe. It was, to say the least, surprising. In every previous conflict, Arab armies had suffered defeat, often humiliating defeat, at the hands of the Israelis. But here were Egyptian troops rolling through the supposedly impregnable Bar-Lev line and reclaiming Arab land. The Egyptians' joy was not to last for very long. But it was a stunning victory which released long pent-up Arab frustration. That first sweet taste of victory made a lasting impression on Arab morale. So much so that Egypt recently decided to stage the crossing again for the benefit of roving report cameras. The resulting film was so remarkable that we're devoting the whole of our program to it this week. First of all, though, let's see the shape of the attack. The massive triangle of Sinai had been seized by the Israelis in 1967, since when they'd established the Bar-Lev line of fortifications along the canal. This gave Israel superb forward defenses. By smashing through the line, Egypt aimed to push those defenses back towards Israel proper. The first problem was the canal itself. It wasn't wide, but getting an army across it was a major operation even without enemy fire. The sides were already steep, but the Israelis had created a further barrier in the shape of sand embankments ranging from 30 to 60 feet in height. It seemed impossible, but in the reenactment you're now about to see, Egypt's Third Army used £500,000 worth of live ammunition to demonstrate just how it was done. "2 p.m. October the 6th. The Bar-Lev line reels under an Egyptian tank and artillery barrage. The Israeli army is only 15 miles away, but Israel is celebrating Yom Kippur, its holiest festival, and the country is caught unprepared. .107mm recoilless rifles cut a path for the infantry through the wire and the mines. Firing from 8 miles away, heavy mortars blast into the strongholds, forcing the Israelis deep into their underground bunkers and keeping their heads down for the infantry crossing. To the Israelis, the Egyptian build-up had appeared no more than the traditional autumn military maneuvers. But the Egyptians had 1,000 guns hidden on the west bank of the canal, and on October the 6th, they opened up. This was one direct hit, an Egyptian-prepared Israeli flag. Under covering fire, Egyptian infantrymen set out across the canal. Their task, to maintain a foothold in Sinai for at least 12 hours until the heavy armor could be brought across. Egyptian intelligence had discovered an Israeli alarm system which pumped blazing oil onto the canal. The Israelis later claimed they'd been bluffing with dummy oil pipes. but the Egyptians played safe and sent engineers the night before the attack to block up the pipes with concrete. In this reenactment, the flag went up first. Last October, it was a machine gun. But even then, every unit did have a flag to plant. The fortresses themselves were undermanned, since some Israeli troops had been given leave for Yom Kippur. Barely 600 men remained, and many of these were middle-aged reservists. They fought desperately, but succumbed sooner or later to the Egyptian onslaught. Each successive wave of attackers carried heavier weapons. After the personal weapons came the first batch of portable infantry guns.
فك الحبل وجهك.
With the strongholds either conquered or kept down, the next task was to go for the tanks behind the Bar-Lev line. One weapon used was the RPG-7, the rocket-propelled grenade. More devastating than the RPGs were the secret Russian Saga missiles. The troops carried them in suitcases on their backs. They were mostly used in desert ambushes. Setting them up was a matter of minutes. The Israelis had seen nothing like them. When they first saw them, they thought they were tree stumps in the desert. With the warhead in place, the weapon is connected to a control panel. It's guided by impulses sent down thin wires which uncoil behind it as it flies. It's almost like flying a model aeroplane. The weapons created devastation among the Israeli armored divisions. One Egyptian unit claimed to have knocked out 8 Israeli tanks in the first 10 minutes. It's an expensive way of waging war. Each missile costs £3,000 and every Saga operator has to fire 100 rockets before he's considered fully trained. Meanwhile, Egypt was pouring more men into Sinai. The Bitter Lakes were being crossed with Yugoslav Topaz troop carriers. This was how they set out to attack the Israeli stronghold at Kabrit. In the whole of the first wave of the attack, the Egyptians crossed 2 armored and 2 infantry divisions. With the infantry in Sinai, the main task was to open gaps in the ramparts to enable bridges to be laid for the heavy armor and equipment. The only solution seemed either gunfire or high explosive. That was nearly 2 tons of dynamite. The noisiest, but not the most effective way of doing it. The holes weren't big enough. The Egyptians had been thinking about the problem for years, but it wasn't until 1971 that a young lieutenant in the engineers came up with the answer. It wasn't another secret Russian weapon, but ordinary irrigation pumps bought from Britain. They took water straight from the canal and delivered it at high pressure to hoses which simply washed the sand away. During the reconstruction, one engine refused to start. Fortunately for the Egyptians, they had no such troubles during the actual attack. Despite the officers' exhortations, the engine stubbornly refused to start. Cutting each hole took the Egyptians about 10 hours, and on that first day, they cut 60 of them. The way was clear for the heavy armor. The Soviet-made T-54, T-55 and T-62 tanks that make up the bulk of Egypt's armor were first brought up to the canal on heavy transporters. The tanks of the canal were still under Israeli attack by artillery and aircraft, even though the artillery's accuracy was affected by its lack of spotters. Smoke machines provided a screen for the Egyptian crossing. To ferry the tanks across, the Egyptians used the Soviet-made GSP tank pontoon. Two of these amphibious lorries joined together to form a pontoon for each tank. Linked together, they were strong enough to take the heavy tanks. The pontoons had been specially developed for crossing the rivers of Europe, but they proved to be ideal for crossing the canal. The new pontoons were yet another surprise for the Israelis, and a steady flow of tanks used them to get across to the holes blasted in the ramparts on the Sinai side. Taking only a few minutes to cross the waterway, the GSPs gave the Egyptians a swift way of building up their armored strength, while the Israeli air attacks were being blunted by the SAM-6 and SAM-7 guided missiles. Israel lost a considerable number of planes in her attacks, but was unable to stop the flow of armor. Another new device used during the canal crossing for the first time was the PMP bridge. This again was developed by the Russians for possible use in Europe. The box-shaped pontoons were dropped into the river and opened up. They were then marshaled into position and joined together to form the bridge. During the exercise specially staged for us, small boats were used to push the pontoons together for joining. Last October, though, a different method was used. According to Israeli survivors from the Bar-Lev strongholds, one pontoon was first dropped into the river. Then a lorry drove out on it to drop a second, which was clipped to it, and so on. The survivors described the bridges as growing like slowly extended arms. The whole building operation took just under half an hour, instead of the 2 hours the Israelis had expected. For more than 2 years, the Egyptians had been preparing for this day. Special models of the canal had been constructed in the Nile Delta for training the assault troops. Studies had been made of the wind and the currents along the canal. and the military even researched in the records of the Suez Canal Authority to find out which day would provide the best current conditions. The speed of the crossing threw out Israel's defensive plans. They'd expected the Egyptian crossing to take 2 days. But 10 hours after the attack began, 500 tanks had crossed either by bridge or by ferry. This is another new weapon, a Saga carrier. 6 of the anti-tank guided missiles were mounted on an armored car, better protected and more mobile than the infantry. This is a BM-21 missile carrier, another Soviet-supplied weapon. The BM's role was to strike at Israeli armor and artillery, counter-attacking the Egyptian advance. The missiles are fired from the cab of the lorry. It remains static, but the blast from the rocket tubes is lethal for 200 yards. This display was put on for us with live ammunition at 800 pounds a time. Their sophisticated weapons allowed the Egyptians to consolidate quickly. But they claim it wasn't machinery that gave them their early success, but the courage of their once despised soldiers. What did Egypt's military leaders learn from the October War? We asked the present commander of the Third Army, Major General Ahmed Badawi.
Many lessons. For example, the importance of the infantryman in modern combat, the value of the man behind the weapon, importance of surprise, the decisiveness of the anti-aircraft missiles in protection of forces, effectiveness of anti-tank guided missiles. The Arab soldier regain his self-confidence and overcome the myth of the Israeli army which cannot be conquered. It became clear that the Israeli army was like any other ordinary army, including several types, brave, normal, and coward soldiers. The main element for the success was the high morale of the soldiers and officers, their insistence on fighting to achieve the victory and regain their land. This element Israel did not bear in mind.
As an example of modern warfare, the October conflict was an impressive display of technical expertise and brave fighting. It was also a horrifying exercise in human destruction. Egypt alone suffered 7,700 casualties, the Israelis 5,000. Egypt, in fact, ended the war having lost more territory to the Israelis, and its Third Army was virtually cut off. But the attack was not a failure, for besides its effect on Arab morale, it did break the Middle East logjam and forced political attempts to find a solution.